Hello and welcome to Heyman Nature. On this crossover episode with the great Bob Murphy, we talk about odds and probability and economics and simulation theory and Drake's equation and Boltzmann brains and all manner of things philosophical and mathematical and epistemological. Um, imagine Imagine a dorm room conversation with really smart people, except we forgot to smoke the weed. It's kind of like that. This one is an awful lot of fun. Please enjoy my conversation about probability with the great Bob Murphy.
Heyman Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Heyman.
Hello, Bob Murphy.
Hello, Adam Heyman.
So, no Twitter beefs this week?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't think so. I think maybe we should talk about something else.
Well, that's great because I got my own bugaboos. If we can for once not talk about your issues, we could talk about my issues, please.
I think so. Yeah, that's part of this relationship. Go ahead. By the way, I should say to people, I was scrolling. I'm not even making this up. And I saw Adam, it was clearly like someone posted a quick Twitter video. And it was you, and with that backdrop with the free Ross and everything. So it was clearly you podcasting. And I just assumed it was going to be you and me. And it was some other guy. And I actually, for a millisecond, actually felt a pang of jealousy. It was really weird. I'm just being honest with you. It was kind of freaked me out. But I just wanted to disclose that.
When my co-host of the Natural Order podcast, Brian O'Leary, heard you refer to him as my ex-boyfriend, he felt the same way. All right. Well,
I imagine the listeners probably want us to actually talk about something, so maybe we should do that.
All right, let's do that, and hopefully it'll be important and relevant. I wrote an article a little while back. We'll link to it, called "Odds, Probability, and Nonsense," because I think we humans fling around the term and the concept probability way too loosely, and it bugs me. And I think we'd be smarter if we didn't do that. Okay. So I'm a professional gambler type. So when I think about probability, it's a pretty precise term. Like when I throw a die on a craps table and it hits the back wall, that little alligator surface, and bounces randomly, I know that it's going to come up one particular number 1 out of 6 times. And similar with assume a properly randomized shuffled deck of cards, the ace of spades is going to be on the top, 1 out of 52 times. So that's what I think about probability and odds. It's a known quantity. Even if there's, randomness and variance in any particular application, it's a closed system. It's a known thing. And most people use the term much more sloppily.
Mm-hmm. I like that adverb.
Sloppily?
Yeah.
You should see my office. So the first time I encountered this problem, I don't know, junior high or something, when somebody talked to me about some teacher was talking about Drake's equation. You're familiar with that?
Yes.
So he's some guy that was trying to find alien sentient life, signals with a radio telescope or something. And he was going to some conference and he wanted to talk about, some estimation about how many alien civilizations we should assume are out there that are within the light cone, speed of light being the limiting factor for communications and all that. So he came up with this real super duper scientific equation where you could figure out in the number of civilizations equals, and then a whole string of variables, the average rate of star formation, the fraction of those stars that have planets, the fraction of those that have habitable planets like ours that could support life, the fraction of those that actually develop life, the fraction of those that develop life that's sentient, the fraction of those that create civilizations that build things that, emit communications that we can detect. And then you total all those up and you get a probability for the existence of life that we can detect. And it's all sciencey and mathy in an equation. It was presented to me as not just a way to inform your intuition on these things, but it was presented to me as a proof. And just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating, after I wrote that article a few months ago, I went around and asked people, what they thought about Drake's equation. And most of them had never heard of it, but the few that had said, yeah, it's that thing where a guy proved, how it proved that alien life exists. And a few of them said it demonstrated that alien life exists. But all of that is nonsense. Every term in there, except maybe the rate of star formation, is just a complete and utter guess. We can't develop a probability for the existence of alien life. We don't have any data points except for the one, us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay to use estimates and probability. Like, sports books get pretty good at estimating the odds that the Packers are going to beat the Bills or whatever. And based on their knowledge of the game, they can make pretty good guesses, but they don't know the odds of who's going to win that game. It's just
if it's a Super Bowl, the Bills will definitely lose.
4 out of 4 times at least.
I don't even, you know what? I'm bluffing here because now I'm not sure. Is that even the right? Like, are the Packers in the right thing for them to even face each other in the Super Bowl?
I don't believe so. I think they're both AF. No,
Okay.
no. You're right. You're right. They could face each other.
Okay.
Sorry.
But I just got lucky because that's how. It's not that I'm not macho, folks. I could take those. I could play with those guys. It's just I choose to go into economics. Okay.
You had 2 paths. You chose the brainier one.
Yes, that was my comparative advantage.
So, yeah. So my big complaint is that we throw around the word probability when we really mean best guess, and educated guess. And sometimes those guesses can be good, but sloppy language leads to sloppy thinking. And if somebody thinks that they've been told a probability, they're going to think, I think, maybe not consciously, but they're going to think of a closed system, just like throwing a die. When that's not what you're talking about. You're just talking about somebody's best guess based on massively incomplete information. Like let's say you've got stock market data, all the possible results. And so you analyze the probability that X, Y, or Z can occur. Well, that's not a closed system. You've only got the transactions that occurred. It doesn't say anything about the transactions that can occur. It's a completely open system. That's, what made Nassim Taleb rise to prominence, I believe. Because these financial analysts were using these models and assuming that they had all the information that was relevant, like it was a closed system and my probability models are accurate, and they're just not. So I don't know where you want to go from that, but it's a thing I've been thinking about. I hate how weak and sloppy we are epistemologically, assuming knowledge that we don't have, and probability is one of the worst offenders in my view.
Yeah, so I agree definitely, and I've been jotting notes here. So again, folks, this is exactly what these crossovers are designed for. That I think there's a lot of fodder here to just unpack some of this stuff. But yeah, that last point you made, I think to me that crystallizes it, and that's the Drake equation always bothered me. So when you said you went to see if you weren't hallucinating, yeah, if you had asked me, you might have thought you were hallucinating because I would have. Well, no, I would have said though that you're right. I don't like the way other people use it, but I would have said, yeah, this is crazy. It gives this fake sense of precision when he's just making stuff up. It's like I'm trying to think of an analogy, and I can't really, like, if we wanted to say, hey, let's estimate, Adam, within 5% probability or confidence interval, how many future Nobel Prize laureates will be directly attributable to listening to our crossover episodes. And I could write out a thing, well, first of all, what's the probability that a man and a woman are going to get together, and then what's the probability that, they're going to have this playing, and then what's the probability that the kid's going to like it, and you can do that and put in some ballpark estimates for each of those numbers and multiply them all together, and then, do other things like, well, but there's other possible people and blah, blah, blah. You could do all that in the binomial theorem, but that would just be goofy. You know what I mean? Like it would give a false sense of rigor and precision when it doesn't exist in that setting. So that was always my problem with the so-called Drake equation.
Wild ass guesses calculated to 4 decimal points. I mean, these terms, he says that, 0.2 to 0.5, 1/5 to 1/2 of all stars formed will have planets. Okay, well, says who?
I mean, in fairness, so now that I agreed with you, let me push back a little bit. So
Sure.
I think on some of them, they're not just literally making stuff up the way, like if you and I said, what's the probability of unborn children who will grow up in a world and find our podcast and like it? Like there's no way we can do it. You know what I mean? I mean, we know it's above, well, no, I was going to say we know it's above 0. Actually, we don't. We know it's below 100. That's really all we know. So maybe Taleb's negative probabilities come into play here.
Right.
But it's, but some like the star formation and the planets and which ones like are the parameters conducive to, or could they support carbon-based life or so? I mean, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, in Drake's equation, he's on more solid ground in the earlier terms, and then it just gets goofier and goofier as you go along, to the point where the likely time horizon for a civilization that will exist and continue to emit radio waves somewhere between 1,000 and 1,000,000 or 100 million years. Well, at least we know that stars and planets exist. Alien species, not so much. The time interval that they continue broadcasting. Come on, man. This is not. But to the average C student, they see a nice equation presented to you by a guy with a PhD after his name, and they think this is rigor. As you said, this is precision. This is an equation. This is math, for crying out loud. Of course, they know the probability of sentient life out there in the universe.
Yeah. And the thing that I do like about it, like why this interests me, besides just the quibble and thinking, that's just another example to throw into the pile of people who use false precision. And this is, of course, in economics all over the place,
for sure.
Especially, I can't remember. I was doing congressional testimony, and it was Brad Sherman, I think, the guy out of California. And he asked me, I was testifying about oil prices or something, and I forget the exact thing, but he asked me something like, okay, well, if my Republican colleagues allowed for drilling or something, what would that do to the price at the pump or something like that? And it wasn't that, but it was something analogous to that. And I just, with the deadpan, gave him an answer to like 3 decimal places just to say how stupid this is. And he was like, that's a pretty specific answer. Okay. Like, you know what I mean? And then later I was looking at this like, I can't believe I did that. Like,
nobody pushed back?
No.
Did you at least look down to consult a chart?
No.
A pretend chart,
No. Folks, I'll try to find that, because that was, at the time, I thought it was so obvious I was kidding that, but then later when I looked at it, I was like, no, I bet most people thought I was serious. And
you should have.
I didn't have to like swear, I didn't have to put my hand in a Bible or something, but I was wondering, like, did I just do something, improper?
At no committee, man. Yeah, well, you should have pulled out your wristwatch, pretended it's a Casio calculator, and then beep, 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 and then gave him.
Yeah. But what I was going to say, though, is so the reason I like this, with my views on intelligent design and all that kind of stuff, is that to me, it's like, right. And so the whole Fermi paradox and everything, like, so doesn't that mean, coupled with the Drake equation, that your estimates of how easy it is for inorganic materials to give rise to cells that then later formed beings that can make radio telescopes, or, that you must be wrong. And yet they're not like, maybe we should rethink that maybe life is harder to emerge than we thought. Like, that's usually, it's like, oh, well, maybe they all nuked each other or something. It must be, maybe it's climate change. Maybe we should probably raise a carbon tax because the Drake equation. You know what I mean? Like, they're not going to go revisit the stuff that they really, is important to their worldview.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we're not talking about all of them, but
no, we are. Let's estimate. Okay, how many of them are dishonest? Say 1/3 to 2/3. Okay, and then
That sounds precise.
Then how many of them have considered the Drake equation? At least 60%. Okay, put that in there. You get what I'm
Yeah,
talking
but
about.
such a bizarre lack of humility. We literally don't know how life started here, but we're going to just make up numbers for how teeming full of life the galaxy is. We can't do that, man. We don't know. At some point, you just have to resign yourself to the fact that we don't know yet. You have to be okay with that.
Yeah. So let me push back on two things. I mean, not push back, but just raise issues. So one thing is going along with what I was saying there about the way I could use it to try to say, okay, so right, there does seem to be this prima facie problem here, right? We should be getting information presumably from all these aliens, or I guess you could, you know, I've seen people say, oh no, they have like their version of the prime directive and they don't
Right.
want to communicate with us, or we're just so uncivilized that they're just like, let's not let them come to the party, you know. So okay, maybe. So there's an analog in economics, just to give a specific example. There's this thing called the Modigliani-Miller theorem. And the conclusion that pops out of it is that a company's I'm just reading the AI overview here. A company's value is not affected by its capital structure or the amount of debt it has. And so the idea is, in plain English, that theorem that came from these, you know, big gun economists says that it doesn't matter whether a firm issues more debt or equity, you know, to raise money to go build a factory or something. And so, like, if you're a potential buyer looking at a company to acquire, or if you're the management running a company and say, hey, we need to get some more money to go build a factory or whatever, it's completely irrelevant to you whether you issue more bonds or raise more equity to finance the project. And so a lot of people hear that and they say, that doesn't seem like it can be right. And I have seen economists defend the theorem and that whole approach by saying, oh, right, it's not that we actually think the result is true, but it's a useful exercise because the Modigliani-Miller theorem, you know, makes some assumptions about perfectly efficient capital markets, blah, 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 you know, makes all these assumptions in order for that result to pop out as it's a theorem. And so if you think that the conclusion is actually empirically false, then you know, okay, so now go look at the assumptions and try to figure out which of these do we think is not correct, you know, because obviously one of these assumptions or more than one must be false. Otherwise the conclusion would be true because it's a theorem. And so, you know, they're just saying it's a useful exercise. It helps you organize your thinking and then isolate what is it that's driving this result in the real world. If we do agree that, yes, surely a company's debt structure, you know, matters. And so couldn't the defender of this say, oh yeah, we know there's a bunch of but given that the Drake equation, given our rough guesses to plug in numbers for those values, pops out that the universe should be teeming with intelligent life, and presumably we would see evidence of it, just as telling us something must be wrong, and it's just helping us organize our thoughts and see where should we look to figure out where do we think our miscalculations entering.
Boy, that is hilarious. In 1992, at Arizona State University, I got myself a business degree, bachelor's in finance. And somewhere around 89 or 90, they told me that Modigliani-Miller theorem. And the upshot, I mean, maybe I'm misremembering, but I'm pretty sure the upshot by some midwit professor is that it literally doesn't matter about the capital structure. They didn't say, so let's go back and look at these assumptions. That never happened. It was presented as if it was true.
I just got a better education than you did because I never heard someone tell me the Drake equation proved that there's intelligent life. I don't think anyone even talked about it. I just, you know, I was a geek and read stuff. But okay, I'm not saying that to be funny. That it's, I never heard someone claim the Drake equation shows us that there must be tons of life. I have always just heard it like that. It's always coupled with the Fermi paradox, and that. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to.
I mean, when I heard that one, it was like junior high or something. So
okay,
but it sort of emphasizes the point I was making earlier. Like my midwit professor just went to the conclusion when the whole point is, and this is a point I was going to raise later. I have no problem with people, you know, making guesses and trying to take estimates of what's going on in the universe or a football game or whatever. But the critical thing is to always lead with your assumptions. What could be wrong with your model? The place
Mhm.
where errors could exist. But most of us people that are short on time and maybe not that brainy, I don't know, we just go right to the conclusion and just take that as take that
Mhm.
as the truth. When the intellectual exercises you were pointing out, I mean, that is useful to think about. Okay, well, we've been doing a lot of other things with economic models that use these assumptions. Maybe some of them are just goofy and wrong, and we should re-examine
Mhm.
that. That would be an intellectual exercise worth having. But most people don't. They just read the précis or whatever,
Yeah.
read the
Yeah.
concluding statement, and think they've learned something.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that comes up a lot in economics. For example, I realized lately when I've been spent a lot of time on the Ricardo comparative advantage stuff, and suppose that U.S. workers are better physically at making TVs and DVDs, but still, if they specialize in the thing where they're really good and then trade with Mexico, all that stuff. And I was just as I was going through it to explain the results, I was realizing all these implicit assumptions, and I'd be, oh, okay. In this example, we're assuming that the American workers are all interchangeable with each other and the Mexican workers are all interchangeable with each other. But if you didn't assume that, then it would affect, some of them actually would be hurt by free trade policy. Okay. We're assuming no shipping costs.
Shipping
And I
costs,
realized
yeah,
like by
yeah.
the end of it, there were assume that the Mexicans are also using US dollars, because if you bring in pesos, that's I still believed in what I was doing. Like I didn't think by the end of it wasn't like I was thinking, oh man, I'm pulling the wool over people's eyes, haha, to get my grift payment from big manufacturing or something, or big importers. But anyway, so I still, but I was just realizing how in economics we just take it for granted so much about, oh yeah, you're not going to deal with those 19 actual things in the real world, because that just complicates the net. We're trying to focus on this thing that we have in our textbooks, and I was taught by my professor, and I thought it was really cool, so I'm going to teach it to you too. So it was that kind of deal. So that does happen a lot, and I have definitely seen how, like a different example, in standard economics, even though you have utility functions, if you go into the history of where those things came from, actually, it doesn't assume that there's such a thing as cardinal utils, right? It's based, you can build those things up if you just assume people have ordinal preference rankings among every possible basket of goods, and then under certain assumptions about continuity and blah, 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 oh, there exists a cardinal utility function that represents those ordinal preferences. But everyone knows, of course, that since you could just do a linear transformation of it and it would still represent it just as well, that no significance should be attached to a util per se. But most people, even in my program, who are studying that stuff and learning the theorems and spitting it back out on the micro exam, I don't think they knew. I think if you said to them, do people psychologically have like a unit of utility? They would say, yeah, of course they do. We just have models where people maximize their utils. What are you talking about? Even though that's literally not the theory that they were just taught, because there's a lot going on. And hey, this is how you solve a problem like this. You take the first derivative and you do this and not, let's think philosophically about what does this mean to have a utility function. So anyway,
We've long thought that you were in the pocket of big import export. So
yes,
glad to.
They pay well.
Yeah, those are all important points you talk about, and like with the trade example, it's not that the principle is wrong. The principle is right, but you have to, if you're actually talking about a real world example, you have to take in the lumpy, problematic real world problems that exist, the places where the assumptions do not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, say for some reason, travel just became 1,000 times more prohibitively expensive. That would clearly break the model, and nobody would trade because not travel, but shipping.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, when I'm criticizing these things that we're doing, I'm just saying that we can't take it to extremes. We have to think through the assumptions and think through the exceptions. And I was thinking about the Laffer curve recently.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always sort of drawn, right? Like originally it was supposed to be drawn on a cocktail napkin or something.
It really, by the way, because I worked for Laffer, I saw, well, he had a napkin that was framed in his office. I don't know if that was supposed to be the original one. I can't remember. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. But it's always funny when it's presented to you in the textbook and probably on a napkin, it has a one point that is certain where if you tax 0, you have zero income. If you tax 100, you have zero income, and then you draw this curve.
Yeah.
Well, in the real world, it's not going to be this smooth curve. But if you just look at that and get the concept and then move on, or if you're just some sort of a midwit, you might think that Mr. Laffer actually drew how government tax revenue will be generated at each point along the line, and it's this nice smooth curve. Well, no, it's not. It's this principle, and it's actually going to be lumpy depending on psychology and how easy it is to get in and out of industries under certain tax burdens. It's going to be this weird looking thing that roughly conforms to this shape, but it's going to be discrete, not continuous. And
I've done an analog of that, like just to isolate the argument, to say at 0 degrees Kelvin we'll have zero tax revenue. At 10,000 degrees Kelvin we'll have zero. So therefore there must exist some temperature that maximizes, and policymakers should think about.
That's perfect. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, there's a range that's a little bit better than all the others.
By the way, let me just mention, I'm not saying you were suggesting otherwise. Laffer himself is aware of this stuff. You're right.
Of course.
He was literally at a thing. Was it Rumsfeld? I forget who it was, but he's trying to get somebody that was going to be in the Reagan administration, like trying to get the guy to see, like, no, we shouldn't be conceding that just if you cut tax rates, it's possible. And also, I'm not saying this for you, Adam, just Laffer in his writing, and I went back and looked. It's not like just after the fact he was trying to cover up. He was always clear. He wasn't saying for any tax rate reduction necessarily revenue goes up. He was just saying there is this offsetting factor that you expand the base. And he said, in certain circumstances, if the rate had been punitively high, then you actually might get more revenue too. But his point was lowering the rate, cutting the rate in half is not going to make revenue drop by 50%.
Right.
That was what his main point was anyway. Okay, well, let me ask something else. We don't need to dwell on this too much because it might take us too far afield. But what's interesting, when you were even saying, like, we know when I throw a die that this happens, or if I flip a coin 1,000 times, even with that stuff, strictly speaking, no, we don't know that.
Correct.
You know what I mean? Like it's like an abstract, almost platonic ideal of a fair die.
Correct.
Or a fair coin. And even if it were a fair coin, strictly speaking, like you know what I mean? Like I could learn how to flip a coin. Like, so if I see heads is on top, I could either make it tails, or, what I mean? Like, it wouldn't flip too many times. If you get what I'm saying. Like, I could just do a very weak.
Or I could imagine a person so skilled at throwing a die that he flips it around in such a way that it doesn't tumble against the alligator back wall of the craps table. It hits square right on a corner, and he's just so deft, and it lands up as a 6 every time.
Right, like, the way Captain America can throw his shield, and apparently he just does the calculations like that's supposed to just be.
I got to come with my assumption too, which is the assumption of a randomized throw.
Yeah.
And then that's why they build the craps table that way, because over time they've experienced that, that does actually yield you a randomized throw in practice in the real world with money at stake. It's good enough. But you do have to come with that assumption.
Yeah. So again, it's right. So you can clarify exactly what you mean. But anyway, I just thought it was interesting that it's even true. When we're talking about the clothes, like strictly speaking, no, we don't. It's more of a, what, and Mises gets into this in Human Action, like about like the philosophy of probability, because his brother Richard von Mises was a mathematician who had written. It's funny. I'm not. You probably know this, Adam. But for the folks at home who don't, Ludwig disagreed with his mathematician brother in Human Action. Like, while Mises is blowing up everybody, the Weber-Fechner law does not imply a violation of diminishing marginal utility or whatever. Or no, he says the Weber-Fechner law has nothing to do with the economic law of diminishing marginal utility. So he's just, quantitative uncertainty has nothing to affect our results here in terms of praxeological import. And oh, by the way, my brother doesn't know what he's talking about, despite his treatise on statistical theory. So Mises was a well-read man, but that he got into that stuff as well. That it is kind of like just a theoretical. It's almost like we're a thought experiment or something. You know what I mean? Or a circular argument almost. When you say, what does it mean that it's a fair die or something? It doesn't mean, oh well, if you threw it 1,000 times in a row, that 1/6 of the time you'd get a 1 and 1/6 you'd get a 2. You're like, no, that
would be very unlikely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, right. Exactly. It'd be unlikely to be perfectly that, and so you can make up things about limiting tendencies or whatever. But it's conceivable. 10,000, you get 10,000 2s in a row. That's very unlikely, but you know what I mean. So anyway, that's it's just interesting that there's actually no way you could even demonstrate that this is a fair die. There's no series of finite list of experiments you could conduct.
No, but if you started with 1,000 throws and it was wherever
Mm-hmm.
it was, all off the, it wouldn't be perfect for each number. And then you increased it, whatever number, whatever spectrum, that's not the right word, whatever distribution of numbers came out of that. If you increase the number of throws to 10,000, it would be closer to 1/6 than it was before. That law of large numbers thing. And then if you increased it to 100,000 throws, it would be closer still.
In expectation, but I'm saying in reality, you could go ahead and do it. And it could be that, it was pretty close to 1/6, but then the next 60 million rounds, it was just all twos.
For sure.
So actually, that could happen even if it were
For
fair.
sure. But it's useful. But I have a good reason to expect it, such that I would bet that I'd be right.
Okay.
In one sense, I know what you're saying. All these things are possible. The black swan event can always occur where it's 100,000 twos in a row.
Yeah.
But we have good reason to think that as the number of iterations increases, it's going to get closer and closer to 1/6.
Yeah, that's fair. But again, that isn't the definition of what
Agreed. Yeah.
a fair die. Anyway, you get the point.
Maybe the simplifying principle is just to say that in real messy life, we are never in the perfectly closed system that's our mental construct here. It's always going to be that anything could happen. But that doesn't make these things not useful. It just means you have to take the messy world into consideration.
Yeah. So let me put it to you this way, and then we can move on, unless you want to keep going.
No.
That to crystal to connect. So it may have come off like I was just making random observations, but I realized there is a way. Again, playing like a devil's advocate here. Couldn't Drake? By the way, at first when I wrote like on the notes to myself that we're gonna cover Drake, like I was picturing the meme. But anyway, the guy that's
I don't know.
I hope I'm not saying the wrong. Isn't he like a rapper or something? And there's a meme.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That'd be a whole different podcast.
Yeah. Here, this guy, he has all this false sense of precision or whatever. He doesn't know what he's talking about. In contrast, I, as a gambler, I know that. And so, again, just to isolate, what I want to say is, aren't you doing the same thing when you're sitting down or when you're going to a craps table and you're thinking, the odds, and you're, telling your wife, don't worry, honey, like I know how to play. Well, you wouldn't sit in on a craps game.
Not a craps, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, you get the point I'm trying to make, that aren't you doing a similar thing where you're just plugging in assumptions about what you think these
for my whole
variables
life
are.
and betting thousands of dollars at the time. And when I do what I think is the objectively right play based on my understanding of odds and psychology and probability and all that, and it doesn't work, I gotta trust my model and go back the next day and do the same thing. And if it doesn't work again, I should probably restudy and make sure I haven't, memorized the wrong game. I'm playing cribbage when I'm supposed to be playing poker or whatever. But yeah, in the face of a world of variance and uncertainty, you got to have the courage of your convictions, which flies in the face of the argument I'm just making. But I'm just saying that you need to be careful.
Right. And like you said, like it's like obviously you have way more experience, but I figured out a system for counting cards and I was playing blackjack. And then I just noticed when the deck was, quote, really good and I would increase my bet, I would bust all the time. And such that it got to the point where I was afraid when the deck would get really good, because I would know, I'm going to feel like I should bet more, but I just know I'm going to lose. And I think partly, I was actually betting too heavily, like more than
you could. Yeah.
Yeah. I asked you the other day on the phone, what is that called again?
The
Kelly criterion.
Kelly criterion.
I think just because my bets were lumpy, like my bankroll wasn't big enough. And so it was like the minimum was such and such. And then I would only ever be betting possibly double the minimum.
That's
and so
it?
if the deck was really good, I'm just saying, given when I was a kid going to the casino.
All right.
You get what I'm saying? Like, in other words, it would have been better if I had found a table where the minimum bet was way lower, but that didn't exist. And so I had to be betting
I
more.
see. Okay.
And so then by the time, like if the deck's really good, I wanted to be able to range my bet, but there I was betting, 30% of my bankroll on that one hand or something. And then, okay. So there's all that stuff. Good. Let me, another element, I could have brought this in earlier, is the, your critique of Drake's equation reminds me of Rothbard's critique of the so-called equation of exchange that's written. It used to be the MV equals P times T. Now it's been morphed into MV equals P times Q. And the idea is that, the money stock times the velocity of circulation equals the price level times the quantity of real output. And when you define those terms as to what they're supposed to mean, yep, it's an accounting identity. It's not a theory. It has to be true. But Rothbard didn't like that because he went in there and he was like, what's the average price level? And what's the total quantity of real output? And so when you go in and try to define what those things are, at least one or two of the elements, you basically just mean, it's like that equals the other two things divided by the other thing. You know what I mean? Like you're kind of just arguing in a big circle. It's not like you can go measure and estimate what's the surface temperature of the sun and come up with something. That's not what the average price level is. You know what I mean? And so anyway,
was there times after that identity was put forward where people would try to misuse it, thinking it wasn't just a tautology or whatever? They'd try to extrapolate one variable based on the values of the other three.
Well, I don't know if this is, so what I'm about to say to you is true, even if the underlying accounting identity made sense, right? Mm-hmm. So this isn't really relevant to Rothbard's critique, but just to answer your question, yeah, it's misused all the time. So, people can say, if there's slack in the, somebody who is a monetarist and doesn't think that running the printing press is going to boost real output would just say, yeah, if you double M, P's just going to double, right? Because one's on one side of the equation, one's on the other. But that doesn't need to happen, right? A Keynesian or an MMTer could say, no, in times of spare capacity and high unemployment, idle resources, if you double M, then maybe Q goes up by 90% and prices just go up a little bit. Like that's also consistent with the equation, right? So there I'm actually using it as a way that a Keynesian could say hard money types misuse it. A different one would be like the GDP accounting thing, where government spending is part of the expenditures. And so there you can say, so if you increase government spending, therefore GDP goes up. When no, it could just mean that private consumption and investment go down. That also balances. So yeah, economists misuse accounting identities all the time. But I guess for Rothbard, the way Rothbard would say, it's abused in the sense that it leads them to think this is a good model of the economy, as opposed to just doing it like the Austrian way and looking at cash balances as another type of good that people hold and doing everything from an individual perspective, right? Like when we try to talk about apple prices, we don't say, what's the total supply of apples in the economy? What's the average velocity of turnover of apples? And therefore, blah, blah. You don't talk like that. It's just, what's the individual given the prices? How many apples does he want to, buy? And then the price is just so anyway. But I just thought, again, that the MV equals PQ, where it's not just that Rothbard was arguing, how do we in practice know it? Like the money stock, that kind of makes sense. Like you go measure what do we mean by how many dollars in the U.S. exist right now? And there's different definitions. Like, does a bank deposit count? What about a savings account? What about a traveler's check? But it kind of makes sense to say how many dollars are there right now. Whereas to say, again, what's the average price level, that's kind of a weird, anyway, like that's a little bit weirder than just saying like, what's the average weight of all humans? Because they'd say, you add them all up and divide by the number of people. But with the price level thing, you're kind of doing a weighting measure as well. Like you wouldn't say, there's a car and that costs $60,000 and there's a stick of gum and that costs a penny. And so the average price level of those two is, somewhere in the middle, like that you wouldn't do that, right? Because the price of the stick of gum shouldn't have as much weight in the final measure as the car. Anyway,
for sure. I see the same problem with velocity too. Mm-hmm. Yes, money does change hands, blah, blah, blah. It goes round and round, but to think of it as a thing that's in any way constant such that you could measure it at some point and then apply it to the future. It just seems weird to me.
Yeah.
Are you ready to talk about the Matrix?
Yes. So, do you want to talk about your good
Yeah,
buddy Bostrom?
yeah. In my in my habit of calling stupid people that are way smarter than myself, I have a big problem with Nick Bostrom and Elon Musk and all the other smarty pantses who say things like it is trillions to one more likely that we live in some simulation. Not the Matrix exactly, but some type of simulation. I think that's really dumb, even dumber than the Drake equation. Their argument is as follows, as I understand it. We humans are the type of species that likes to make simulations and then dive into them, witness all video games and virtual reality machines and this and that and the other. Also, technology seems to constantly improve, doesn't show any signs of stopping. Therefore, we humans will one day invent a simulation that is indetectable by the beings that are in the simulation, indistinguishable from the real world. And given that time is, they say, infinite, it's much more likely that we will be, we will wake up and be born or whatever in a simulation rather than the very vastly remote chance that we happen to be in the base universe before simulations have ever been invented.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate to I hate to criticize people who are better at math than me and criticize people who can shoot a rocket into space and then bring it back and then catch it with a pair of chopsticks, even though it's as big as a skyscraper. That's mighty impressive. But at least Mr. Drake, when he's talking about the likelihood of sentient life out there in the universe, at least he had one data point to talk about, us.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as humans creating simulations that are indistinguishable from reality from the perspective of being in this simulation, well, no one's ever done that. That's just an out and out assertion being treated as a probabilistic certainty to the point that it's trillions to one more likely that we're in a simulation than not. And that's just a massive hallucination. And it brings up my point earlier where we have a useful concept called probability, and then we get sloppy and just throw that label around all over the place. And it's dumb and we shouldn't do that.
Yeah. I also, something doesn't sit right with me. And I think for most people too, that when they see an argument like that, I guess I'm glad that he makes it because it is useful. It's sort of like how I feel with Steve Landsberg's stuff. A lot of Steve Landsberg's arguments to me almost sounds like he's trolling and just pretending like this is what, an economist on a reductio ad absurdum would end up arguing. Like he ends up in one place, he argues that the government should subsidize people to have sex in order to reduce STDs or something like that. And he's like, what? And I think I have the argument correct. So anyway, but I'm glad he does that, even when I think he's nuts, because it is useful for the reason I said before, that you can just go through, because he's very clear, and to say, these are my assumptions, and then this is the argument that pops out. And like he did a recent one on abortion. I'm going to have him on my show to flesh it out once his schedule allows, where he ended up saying, no, it shouldn't be using standard policy analysis. It shouldn't be prohibited, but maybe we should tax it and then subsidize people to have babies and things like that. You know what I mean? Like this weird stuff like that, like even like not taking a stand on whether it's murder or not kind of deal.
Right.
And so anyway, and I was getting riled up reading it. I also was pounding cups of coffee because I was in a different time zone. I was all screwed up. But I told him over email, I said something like, your analysis was infuriating me or whatever, but it was extra annoying because I couldn't figure out what mistake you had made in your logic. You know what I mean? So I was actually like, whereas if I had known, here's where he screwed up, then I would have been relieved. But it was like, no, I cannot abide this outcome, but I can't figure out, where the fallacy crept in. So anyway, I think a lot of people probably feel the same way with these simulation arguments. Should I bring in the Boltzmann brain stuff since it's similar?
Yeah, and just real quick, I usually lead before I criticize simulation theory. I usually lead with, I forgot to, I love simulation theory.
Okay.
Just
Yeah.
as a mental construct, I love it. I think about it
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah.
It soothes me in a way that not maybe being, thinking of heaven sort of soothes other people. I don't think it's true, but
Mhm.
I love it as a mental model. And I mean, I love science fiction. I love thinking about ways things could be. What bothers me is this certainty of these trillions to one probability. That's just
Right.
nutty. And it may
Okay.
be
So,
true, for all I know, I'll wake up and it'll be that Rick and Morty episode where you were Mort and you beat cancer and you went back to the mattress store.
I
Real.
don't know what you're talking about.
It's a video game where Morty puts the quarter in and he's sunk into an 80-year lifespan that takes 10 minutes in the real world or whatever, and he's just this guy who owns a mattress store and has a family, and he gets cancer and he beats cancer, but instead of going off and sailing the world with his money, he goes back to the mattress store. And so when he ends up dying, Rick's there criticizing the way he played the game.
Oh. Okay.
But
yeah. So let me just to isolate your view or unpack it. You like the classic Descartes thing about, well, how do I know an evil demon's not deceiving me? And then you just keep.
Right.
So you think that's great philosophy and like that. Yes, we should think through stuff like that. Like we should be able to come up with an answer. If someone says, how do we know we're not living in a simulation? We should think about that stuff because it's if nothing else, it's fun. Your problem is though, if somebody says, because of these deliberations I've just gone through, I conclude that it's trillions to one against us not being in a simulation.
Yeah, simulation theory and Descartes' evil demon and the classic philosopher's brain in a vat scenario, I think these are all interesting things to think about. But I do think people make massive logical errors when they just assume that the weird thing that is in contradiction with just everything in our waking experience, when they assume the other thing, the weird thing, has to be true. I just think that's crazy. Well, I mean, Descartes didn't do that, but some philosophers do. And
So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And Elon Musk and Nick Bostrom do. They think the brain in the vat is way more likely.
So in fairness to Bostrom, when I haven't read him in the original stuff. I did read the Wikipedia articles to get ready for this because that's how committed I am to truth. The way his argument was distilled in the Wikipedia entry on this topic, it didn't say, and so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it didn't say Bostrom claimed that yes, it's trillions to one. Rather, it said something like, if we assume, it was sort of like an exclusionary argument. He was saying like either it's got to be that intelligent species for some reason don't like making simulations, or you know what I mean? Like he was kind of setting up a thing that it was more, he was just stating, here's the train of logic. And if you think there's anything more than a 1 in a billion chance that an intelligent species that had the ability to make a simulation would in fact do so, well, then now you're painted into a corner. You know what I mean? So it was that kind of an argument that where the way it was presented again in the Wikipedia entry was more that Bostrom's just forcing us to really revisit our hypotheses. And so if you don't want to believe that we're in a simulation, then it must mean that you either think there is no other intelligent species, or for some reason they really, really would not want to do a simulation, because otherwise it's got to be that it's more likely we're in a simulation. It was that
for
kind of
sure.
idea.
He presented it with that kind of intellectual rigor, but then I'm just going off hearing him on a podcast where the host asked him point blank, yeah, but what do you think? And he says, yeah, I for sure think we're in a simulation.
Okay, great. So I feel just better about it that we're not misrepresenting. Just like with Drake, technically, I don't know how he himself
neither do I
presented it. It's just like you're saying, we're talking about how do people use it, and maybe like for a different example, go back to economics. Apparently, so there's the Black-Scholes option pricing formula.
Yeah.
Apparently, there are obviously assumptions that are built into that result popping out that can be wrong in the real world. And apparently Fisher Black himself was surprised at how much Wall Street just ran off with that formula. And he was like, don't they understand all the, simplifying assumptions we made? And that was just kind of a first approximation to take a stab at how the heck would you price something like this? We didn't intend it to be a user's guide.
I'm telling you, maybe my professors were all just goofballs, but the capital asset pricing model was just presented as, this is the way it is. Go forth and use this tool. And I'm like, really?
Okay, so maybe can I just do the Boltzmann brain thing fast, and then we can deal, because it's
absolutely.
kind of analogous.
Yeah.
So this is one that intrigued me. I was watching what the heck was it? Who is the guy? He's the Christian apologist who debates a lot. Do you know what I'm talking about, Adam?
Mm-mm.
It'll come to me. Anyway, this Christian apologist guy who's very well spoken, and he just knows a lot of secular stuff, but he goes around debating like Sam Harris and whatever. And he's into Molinism too. So anyway, the people in the audience probably are screaming at me like, Bob, how's this guy's name escaping you? And so anyway, he was debating some guy on theory, like cosmology, like the origin of the universe and that stuff. And this guy was, I think, a physicist. And so it was just interesting that this guy I'm talking about, the Christian apologist, who I think had a philosophy PhD or something, just he knew enough to hold his own with this guy. Of course, the scientist would say the other guy was right, who was an atheist, and this guy was wrong. But he was trying to use cosmological arguments to support biblical not a 6-day creation, but just to say that, yeah, that it shows us that, hey, it's not that the universe has existed forever. And so really, science is catching up to
Right.
the Christian Bible kind of deal. But one of the things he brought up is he said, and on this thing, if you didn't think there was a God that created everything, it's much more likely that we're a Boltzmann brain. And he was using that, and the other guy was countering, and they're just throwing around this phrase Boltzmann brain. And I was, what the heck are they talking about? So I looked it up, and it's intriguing. And so the idea, just real quickly for folks, is that according to quantum mechanics, there very unlikely things could happen, right? So there could be a possible universe somewhere that is just our solar system, right? Like that whole universe is nothing but our solar system with the same laws of physics. It's a self-contained thing, and there's nothing else. It's possible. And if you believe in a multiverse, then clearly there exists a particular universe where that's all there is. There's also a universe, that's 60,000 times bigger than ours, that many more galaxies where there's a universe where, the melting point of water is something else, and da-da-da-da-da. And you know what? There's also a universe where there's just a human brain that exists for a fleeting, not even a millisecond, but just a fleeting, quantum foam. It comes into existence in the exact configuration. Even, you might say, well, wouldn't it die? Well, yeah, but it only exists for a very tiny fraction of time. So it's not time for it to die. It just pops into existence and then poof, goes away because of quantum fluctuations. But in that brief interval, it's just enough time for it to have a conscious thought and to be self-aware. And it has a whole memory of all of its, being born and being a little kid and its parents yelling at it. And then, the girl had a crush on it down the street and da-da-da-da. And up to this moment, it's knowledge of F equals MA and blah, blah, blah. And how big, and it's just this lone brain, and maybe nervous system or something, just existing in isolation for a tiny fraction of a second, and it has all that. And so that right now, what you're experiencing is your conscious experience is just that, or it's much more likely that that's what it is, rather than there's actually this whole universe that's existed for billions of years, and you arose through evolution and and you really did it. You know what I mean? It's like, because that's so much more complicated. Like, it's Occam's razor. Given that you're having your subjective experience right now, it's way more likely, if you believe in the multiverse, that you're a Boltzmann brain, not that you actually are, a being who's had the history. Because you said, no, but I remember all my experiences. That's exactly what it would feel like to be a Boltzmann brain. And so anyway, most people are like, I don't know, something's got to be wrong there. But it's kind of hard to put your finger on. And what was interesting, this last thing I'll say, and I've been doing a filibustering here, Adam, that when I was watching YouTube videos on it just to see more about it, one of the arguments that the person made, like the narrator, which I don't know if this is like the philosophical response, but said something like, one response to this has been, scientists have pointed out, if you were a Boltzmann brain, then you have no reason to believe in all the arguments that Boltzmann just offered, right? Like his arguments about the multiverse and depend on us having accurate theories of reality. And so therefore it's kind of undercutting its own, like, in other words, if it were correct that you were probably a Boltzmann brain, then the way that you would establish that it's almost certainly the case that you're a Boltzmann brain would collapse. You'd have no reason to trust that chain of reasoning because it seems logical to you. If you're just a Boltzmann brain, maybe what seems reasonable to you in airtight logic is crazy. And so they said, so it kind of undercuts itself, so we didn't need to worry about it. And what I thought was interesting is that's very similar to C.S. Lewis saying if the evolutionists were correct, meaning it's just pure blind chance materialism. He didn't have a problem about the origin of the species. Well, then what reason do we have to believe in that stuff? You know what I mean? Like just because evolution seems compelling to you, it also, you can see mirages and stuff because that's just how you evolved and blah, blah, blah. So, why do you trust your own logic? Anyway, I've been rambling, but there you go.
Yeah, my response to things like that Boltzmann brain is that we don't understand quantum mechanics and things that we think may be happening, at that tiny level. I don't think they scale such that a brain can just pop into existence. I just think that's goofy. And next on my list after Boltzmann brain here in my notes was the whole multiverse concept. We've it's in superhero movies now. I think the populace just sort of thinks, oh yeah, physicists must just know that there's multiverses or we live in a multiverse. And I don't think there's any particularly good reason to think that's the case. I think that's a cheat. I think that's technically true. It's a cheat to try and make sense of some of the equations that we don't really understand. We could make things work with them, but we don't understand how they work. And to try and understand them, we've invented something that seems goofy as as all heck, a multiverse scenario. You're familiar with the great heroic philosopher Michael Huemer, right?
Yes.
Who wrote The Problem of Political Authority and a couple of books, or a book on intuitionism I like quite a bit. I haven't delved deeply into his argument, but I know he's arguing for the existence of reincarnation. And the cornerstone of his argument is that time is infinite and it runs in both dimensions, forwards and backwards. And I just don't see any reason to think that that's true. I mean, what possible evidence would we have that that's true? Is it because we create equations with time in them and we can put a minus sign next to the t? I mean, is that really... what I was talking about earlier is the pretense of knowledge by which we come up with this idea and then we just assume it's true. And then we pile more hypotheses on top of that assumption. And then we get to, well, then therefore reincarnation is true, or the simulation theory is true, or brains can just pop into existence and you might be one. And just, it's a false memory of everything you think you know. And then you pop right at it. I mean, these are all just really goofy things to believe. They're interesting things to think about, Maybe it's true. I don't know, but to talk yourself into it's probably true, I'm just not buying it. My epistemological knee-jerk reaction is just, that's not true. That's a bunch of crap.
Yeah, and like I said, I think most people, they do kind of like, especially like the Boltzmann brain thing. Like in principle, everybody should just stop doing research and be like, oh my gosh, until we figure this out. But then it's also like, well, if that is the case, okay, so that means I'm just going to pop out of existence and just keep going through, and I'm a succession of subjective experiences, or you wouldn't know, right? I guess maybe that's the way you can handle it, is just say, practically speaking, all right, if that's the case, then it's not that I need to change the course of my life because this is just a fleeting thing, and it seems right now like I have my life before me, and how do I want to proceed? But actually, that's an illusion, and that's what it would feel like if you just popped into existence.
There's a certain segment of the population who would just say, "Well, I guess I just might as well just quit my job and binge watch Breaking Bad for the rest of the month."
Well, I mean, they might, but I'm saying I think strictly speaking, that doesn't follow. Just like if some philosopher says there's no such thing as free will. And then people are like, oh, I guess I'm not going to look both ways when I cross the street. Like, that doesn't actually follow.
No, but psychology being what it is,
right?
Again, it doesn't follow, but on the margin, people will decide that. Because,
exactly. Let's see what I had jotted some notes. Oh, one thing I wanted to say is this is interesting because this whole discussion intersects with the stuff I've been doing where I've been talking to a lot of different experts. I think you as well. Notice how I'm excluding you from expert on AI, like these large language models and stuff. And a lot of people, I think you included, are saying, no, these things are not intelligent. Like, I think maybe you're open philosophically, the idea that maybe one day they could be, but I haven't seen anything in practice that would lead me to believe this thing is intelligent. at least if something approaching, human level, because they can't even, play 20 questions, that sort of deal. But what was interesting to me is there's one school of thought, at least, that is going to say, no matter what we do, hey, it's just a bunch of electrons moving around ultimately. And so, no, that thing isn't thinking. Maybe it's giving the appearance of, but I have no reason to believe that there's a subjective experience going on inside that thing. And so I want to take that and say, if you understand that perspective, even if we do build a simulation and we have in the computer like, and then, gases coalesce into stars, and then in some of the cases there's planets orbiting at the right distance so that life can emerge according to how we think it did, and then there can be intelligent beings eventually that are walking around and pontificating, and look at all this literature that they're writing, and they're making their own movies and and I wonder if they know that actually they're in our simulation in our laptop, and they probably think that that's their real objective. And I want to say, how do we know they're having subjective experiences, right? Like, I can certainly play a video game and, a character can come up and say stuff to me. I don't think that there's really a character who believes they're giving me the hint on how to break into the Joker's lair inside the game. If I'm Batman in the game,
right?
Remember that level. No, that was just programmed. You get what I'm saying? So even on its own terms, even if we do make simulation, and for us to worry, what if we're a simulation? There's one school of thought that could say, we don't need to worry about that, because a simulated being, even if it on the surface had the appearance of being intelligent and had thoughts and hopes and dreams and blah, 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 and self-awareness, that would all just be programmed in there. And it's
interesting because as you were talking, it made me think that kind of super hard determinism would lead to solipsism too, right? Because, okay, I guess you're aware of your own thoughts and existence, but you can't tell that the AI is thinking, no matter how much it looks like it is. Well, doesn't that apply to your mom and your wife?
Yes, except so right. And so I think the move though is that the person gets it right. And so that, like, again, just for a specific example, I'm a Christian, and so I think there is something beyond the subjective material world, and people have souls, and I don't fully understand it, but I think that must have something to do with my subjective experience. And it has something to do with free will. And, we've talked about my stab at that maybe there really is the physical world. That's just, it's like we're watching a movie. And if the creators of the movie made it such that wherever you put your eye, that's where the red dot goes, it would feel like you were influencing some portion of the film. Likewise, it sure seems like I can control my hands, but I can't control that truck coming at me. And so maybe it's like, no, you really can't control your hands in one sense. But if the whole thing was designed with you in mind, watching this movie, as it were, okay. So I'm just saying, given that, I don't think God would have designed the whole universe just for me, and that I'm the only one that's actually having these subjective experiences, and the rest of you are fake as a rock. So I do think, well, if it works for me, presumably these other people who on the surface look like me and behave like me, I'm assuming you probably have an internal monologue as well, or you get what I'm saying.
Sure.
But I have some basis, because my theory of where I come from allows for that. Whereas, if you're, well, anyway, I guess if you're Daniel Dennett too, you could say, my theory of how consciousness emerged for me would apply to everybody else too. And so but he would presumably give it to computers as well, because in his worldview, that's possible. It's just a level of computational ability gives rise to consciousness or something. But I'm just saying, for those denying that, I could see them nipping all this in the bud and just saying, no, why would I think, or even a disembodied brain in a Boltzmann multiverse thing, no, it wouldn't necessarily have a soul. If God wanted to give it a soul, then I guess it would. But in that case, it really is existing, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. We should link to that argument that you made about the red dot, because it's a slick one. Just in case people haven't heard my view on AIs, I can't say that artificial general intelligence can exist. I don't know if it can or not, but I think that these LLMs are a dead end. I think they're in the wrong direction. They're not thinking. I don't see how they ever could. I think that if we ever were to build something or create something, build isn't right, because I think the thing would have to build itself. I think we'd have to put one of these super fancy neural nets in a body, put it in a physical environment, give it some motivation for getting up off the ground, something similar to our sense of hunger, thirst, lust, anger, something to drive it to want to accomplish goals, and then see if it can bootstrap itself into something that actually can play 20 questions. Because the LLMs are just a parlor trick. They're not thinking. They're very cool. They're very useful. They can spit back useful versions of human language, but since they can't think of an object and play 20 questions, they're not thinking.
So you're saying if we programmed it with the desire to like get a girlfriend, and it knew, no, if I can play 20 questions in a very clever, charming way, maybe then it could work.
I think that's the only way you can get a girlfriend. If
All right, well, I can't think of a better place to end this episode.
That sounds pretty good. All right, ladies and gentlemen, either go check out heymannature.substack.com or YouTube /@heymannature or BobMurphyShow.com. Is that?
Yep. And at Bob Murphy Econ on the X platform.
On the X platform. I'll put a link to mine as well, at ReRaiser, spelled with a Z. Thank you very much, Bob, for talking to me about smart and interesting things. I appreciate it. And thank you for watching our little show.
Thanks, Adam. So long, everybody.